Chautauqua Institution celebrates its 145th season with a mission to explore the best in human values. The talk you are about to hear is part of a program that records the morning amphitheater lectures, the afternoon interfaith and literary arts lectures at the Hall of Philosophy, the inspiring morning worship services at the amphitheater, and other special events. We take you now to Chautauqua, where today's program is about to begin.
And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, The Spirituality of Work. Our distinguished guest today, of course, it's why you're here, is Sister Joan Chittister. Sister Joan is one of the most influential religious and social leaders of our time. For 40 years, she has passionately advocated on behalf of peace, human rights, women's issues, and church renewal. A much sought-after speaker, counselor, and clear voice that bridges across all religions, she is also a best-selling author of more than 50 books, hundreds of articles, an online column for the National Catholic Reporter, and a blog for the Huffington Post. She has received numerous writing awards and honors for her work, and is a noted international lecturer as well as a former fellow at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University in England. She has appeared on Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday, Meet the Press, 60 Minutes, CBS News, Now with Bill Moyers, and numerous BBC and NPR programs. She has been and still is one of the most popular and requested speakers here at Chautauqua Institution for over 30 years. In 2014, the Joan Chittister Lecture Series was inaugurated at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania, in conjunction with the dedication of the Helen Boyle Memorial Archive in Joan's honor, Helen Boyle being a Chautauquan. Serving as co-chair with Joan Brown Campbell of the Global Peace Initiative of Women, a partner organization of the UN facilitating a worldwide network of women peace builders, she was also an advisor for the groundbreaking report, A Woman's Nation, led by Maria Shriver, and was a member of the TED Prize-sponsored Council of Sages, an interfaith group that developed a charter for compassion being promulgated worldwide with all faith organizations. She has served as president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, president of the Conference of American Benedictine Prioresses, and was prioress of the Benedictine Sisters of Erie for 12 years. She received her doctorate in speech communications from Penn State University, the primary site of her archive collection. Joan Chittister is a member of the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, Pennsylvania, serving as executive director of Bennett Vision, a resource and research center for contemporary spirituality, and as founder and animator of Monasteries of the Heart, a web-based movement sharing Benedictine spirituality with contemporary seekers. The title of Sister Joan's lecture today is The Spirituality of Relationship, a New Paradigm for Work, and today's lecture is based on her new book, Radical Spirit. I think of Sister Joan when I think of Radical Spirit, so that's... And if you don't know her, you will find out very soon about that. You'll be pleased to know that Sister Joan will be signing books over in front of the Hall of Missions, and they will also be for sale by our bookstore. And we're grateful to the Presbyterian Association of Chautauqua Religious Lectureship Fund for providing sponsorship for today's interfaith lecture. And I just have to say, it's not often you get to introduce one of your heroes. It is an indescribable honor to present to you Sister Joan Chittister.
Don't go too far. This may be too high.
Okay, if it's too high, I'll move it.
That's great. It's okay. You know, I have to be honest with you. You hear an introduction like that, and just one thing goes through my mind. One of these days, I got to get a day job. I haven't earned a decent living for years, so thank you all. However, before we begin this afternoon's work, there is another question that is begging to be asked. You got to wonder about this administration. Why why would anybody in their right mind invite a Benedictine nun who has never, ever been in a corporate system in the workplace to talk about work? Or a translation of that is, what is a nice girl like me doing in a place like this? Actually, it makes a lot of sense, though it may not seem so at first. The Benedictine order is over 1,500 years old, and it has come to be characterized over the centuries by two mottos. The first motto, Pax, is actually in conjunction with its communal dimension, and an element that says that we are able to, we can prove that peace is possible simply because strangers can live together in peace. But the second motto that characterizes us is ora et labora, prayer and work as equal dimensions of the spiritual life. Now, many of you in the audience may well know that communities founded after the 18th century were often founded to do a particular work: nursing, teaching, orphans, missionary work. Benedictines were founded in the 6th century, and there was no particular work defined for the order at all. It was simply groups trying to live a spiritual life, an ordinary spiritual life, in an extraordinary way. Now, there's a problem with that, because as the time went by, I began to hear people saying, well, you know what nuns are. Those are religious orders that do good work. Except for the Benedictines, they're good for nothing. The fact of the matter is, however, that Benedictines say an awful lot about work in their rule. In this ancient rule, it was quite emphatic. In an era of slaves and servants, there were to be no slaves and no servants in the monastery. The rule reads, "We earn our bread by the sweat of our brow, just like our ancestors before us." So rather than adopt any single work that would be likely to disappear over time the way buggy whips gave way to automobiles, Benedictines had to decide, century by century, what work was most needed at that time that they should be doing. So when you read the work list of the Benedictine order, as the centuries passed, the works passed. So Benedictines opened the first hospitals and the first hospices for travelers. I always say we were the first holiday inns on the globe. They took on responsibilities for organizing the civil system. They preserved learning by copying books. They hired peasants and taught them agricultural skills. They seeded all of Europe with crops. They dried swamps, distilled liquors, and brewed beers. It wasn't all bad. And they took bad land and made it green. Point: Benedictines are more than qualified to talk about the important work of their ages. So I've come today, as you begin to talk about the nature of modern work, to consider the kinds of works most needed in this time, in our time, and what inner work must be done by all of us if we want whatever work we do publicly to be a gift to the future. So I'm about to deal with 4 major questions. Who are we and where are we as a people at this time? Where do our present ideas and principles come from? What are the implications of those positions for this country and for this culture? Is there any model anywhere for dealing with them? In fact, as I came across it, I heard 2 things. You remember, of course, Toffler, who wrote, "If we do not shape the future, we shall be compelled to endure it." And then I heard a story about 2 older people, Ethel and Bernie. Ethel and Bernie were beginning to notice that They weren't quite as sharp as they used to be. He didn't know where the keys were. She didn't know the door was open, that kind of stuff. So they decided that they would kind of help one another. They begin to write little things down, just little notes. So one night they're watching television and Bernie looks at Ethel and he says to her, "You want anything from the kitchen?" And she says, "Yeah, I think I do. Bring me a dish of vanilla ice cream." He said, "Okay." She said, "Write it down." He said, "I can remember vanilla ice cream." She said, "Yeah, but I want you to put chocolate on top of it. Write it down." He said, "Ethel, this is not a problem." She said, "I want a cherry too. Write it down." He said, "I'm not going to get silly about this, Ethel. I mean, it's fine if it works well, but we're not going to be extreme about this." So he leaves. He's gone a long time. She can hear the cupboards moving, the pans are out, the water is running. Pretty soon he comes in carrying a silver tray full of ham and eggs. And she looks at him and says, "I told you to write it down. I knew you'd forget the toast." It doesn't make any difference how committed we are to any document in our lives. Fact of the matter is, it's good to review it every once in a while, to ask ourselves what's missing, what are we forgetting that could change the way we do our work and so could also change life around us. So let's begin. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I wanted to say one other thing to you before we got started, and we're just going to have to worry about that later. It's out there with the toast. But there are three stories that do underline this presentation. The first one is from an old abbot in the 5th century who wrote, "It is well said by a wise person that the soul has as many masters as it has passions, and people are slaves to whatever masters them." I want to deal today with what it takes to recognize what is mastering us and then discover what it will take to enable us to break the chains. The second story is about a Sufi who was found on the way to the mosque, searching frantically in the sand, wailing, crying for help. And many good pilgrims all stopped to help him. Finally, after hours of fruitless search, one of the pilgrims said, "Sufi, are you sure you lost your treasure here?" And the Sufi replied, No, I didn't lose my treasure here. I lost my treasure on the other side of those mountains. The pilgrims were flabbergasted, but Sufi, if you know that you didn't lose your treasure here, why in the name of Allah are you looking for it here? And the Sufi said, "I'm looking for it here because there's more light here." We need to ask ourselves where we need to go to find a better light, to enable us to see where we've lost the values and valuables of our own lives. The third insight that drives this reflection is from Solomon ibn Gabriel, who said, "Of what avail is an open eye if the heart be blind?" Our world, the United States, is tilting and turning in ways we never thought possible. The headlines in our daily papers are a cacophony of rage and violence, of control and power plays, of personal insult and class competition. Whatever happened to the heart of it? Every major institution in society, marriage, family, government, education, and certainly work, and even the churches, are in a state of turmoil, of breakdown, of division and decline. And the rest of us are exhausted, looking for a cure for deep-seated public depression and high-level tension. We need to ask ourselves where we can find a light to help us plot our way beyond the times of clear consensus behind us and through this time of contradictory values. We're at a defining moment, it seems. The United States no longer lays claim to being the leader of the free world. No, now, instead, we're more committed to a national policy of America first, free of concern in a global world for the interests or equality of others. Now we want to win and win and win till we're sick of winning. Now we want to stratify society by using race, ethnicity, and color as a measurement of welcome. We want to recommit ourselves to pioneer values of rugged individualism, which translated means ruthless, unregulated competition, rather than compassion and communal responsibility. We want, it seems, to forsake the soul of a country, once the beacon of the world, in search of freedom and justice for all. It's at best a shocking re-envisioning of national values. After all, this was the country that in the course of a war designed to save the world from fascism, rebuilt the very countries to which it had done devastating destruction. This was the country that led the international war crimes trials and forged the notion that individual conscience superseded even official orders to evil. And yet this same country is now having to choose between facts and alternative facts, as if there is any such thing, between news and fake news, as if a commitment to truth, the very essence of journalism, was even debatable, and whose women have been left to work under the shadow of a rape culture for the privilege of simply being allowed to work at all. How? How can we have come to this point and never even have the grace to blush? How could such an erosion of ideals have come to pass so quickly, so completely, so opposed to both conscience and character? But the fact is that this torturous twist of American ideals has really been in process for generations. In process for generations. We should have seen it coming. The history of these ideas is a clear one. The Enlightenment movement of the 18th century, with its emphasis on human reason as the primary source of authority, undermined both the divine right of kings and the absolutism of church law. Those were surely good things. They were also surely dangerous ones. And this Enlightenment swept Europe. 6 major countries were affected by it at the same time: France, Germany, England, Russia, Italy, and the newly minted United States. But each of them absorbed it in somewhat different ways. What was the American response? It was the Constitution of the United States and its emphasis on individual rights and democratic participation. Immanuel Kant's essay in 1784, entitled, "What is the Enlightenment?" put in one searing sentence the essence of the movement when he wrote, "Dare to know. Dare to know. Have courage to use your own reason." And with that, the glorification of individual rationality began. All the old absolutes disappeared. The revolt against medieval philosophy generated whole new areas of speculation untethered from religion, while elements in the laboratory and galaxies in space made even the concept of God uncertain, if not actually suspect. There was no unity of faith left. No certainty of belief, no common commitment to just about anything. Everything was up for grabs now. A world fresh from this new focus on the Enlightenment and the achievements of science had now found itself with very little to worship, except perhaps itself. And so the time was ripe, wasn't it? Now, for the first time in history, humanity itself became the focus of philosophical thought. You heard it in school, it made no sense to you then. Descartes' dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Note well, not I feel, therefore I am, or I aspire, therefore I am, or I believe, therefore I am. No, I think, therefore I am, became the battle cry of intellectualism, the liberation from absolute authority everywhere. Old categories of thought, old philosophical questions that had been the very bedrock of academic debate since Plato, like what is beauty? What is goodness? What is pleasure? What is pain? What is the immortality of the soul? Gave way to almost total concentration on the concept of the self. By the early 19th century, the philosopher Hegel defined self as the life and death struggle with the other. What is self? It is the life and death struggle with the other. He argued, in other words, that the self is, quote, will and power in contest with the will to power in others. My will and power in contest with the will to power in others. And so the eternal war for personal preeminence begins. Suddenly, self became the focus of action, the center of thought, the very locus of human meaning. The way was laid now for the kind of individual autonomy that communitarian society had never known, could not even imagine. The self itself had become the center of the universe. And to confirm it, modern psychology, which incidentally was a relatively new 19th century invention, and a kind of outgrowth of this new interest in what it was to be human, measured and surveyed and reduced the human person to the sum total of experimental studies to the same degree and in the same manner as inert matter had become the subject of the scientific method. And from there, the slide to individualism and self-centeredness, to human development theories and personal growth institutes, to personal achievement and individual control models, and so to the self's shadow, virtue, narcissism. The need to be first, the greatest, unparalleled and unequaled, both personally and nationally, now followed swift and sure. Then me first, and my money, conspicuous consumption, and a minimum wage rather than a living wage became the norm. Those who could get it themselves got it, and those who couldn't, didn't. Then Marie Antoinette's purported brutish response to the complaints of starving French peasants, well, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake, became in our day the cry to worthiness. We're not going to support those loafers and leeches and welfare queens, what we kindly call the needy of our time. Let them get a job, we say, no matter that there aren't any, for which these uneducated, mentally and physically disabled, and unskilled people can possibly qualify. And our budget reforms threaten the social safety net that once provided health insurance to some degree, education and food stamps, child care and old age pensions for those without the means to get those things for themselves. Then now, America becomes a plutocracy and celebrates the new individualism by reducing the working class to work without benefits and forgetting all that nice talk about equal opportunity. Like Marie Antoinette, we forget that the public aid given to maintain needy individuals also serves to maintain the higher quality of the entire society as well, and that without it, eventually, we will all suffer in the end, and our property values with them. But more changes than simply the economic strata in a country. It changes us, too. Our attitudes toward others deteriorates, while our sense of self blooms. And then suddenly pride, pathological pride, masters us as a people. And we start to believe our own press. We really think we are the best, the brightest, the incomparable, despite the fact that the 2017 Pew Research data on global student rankings indicates that the United States has dropped to 24th place in science, 24th place in reading, 38th place in math, and the United States itself has dropped from 3rd place to 19th in the world happiness quotient. And yet we float right along, feeling invincible, smugly tone deaf to our own slip slide down those ranks from a country once considered outstanding to average to irrelevant as far as the rest of the world is now concerned. And so in 1968, for the first time in clinical history, psychiatrists identified the narcissistic personality and its grandiosity. Its limitless need for attention, its lack of empathy for others, its aggressive personality style, and its relationship dysfunction as a personality disorder. Suddenly, Hegel's warning that the self is simply a will to power in contest with someone else's will to power became the nature of modern society. Kim Jong-un wants his own nuclear weapon. Amazon wants to own every store in the country. Russia wants to be indomitable. Xi Jinping wants unlimited power. And the United States ignores international negotiations to satisfy its own agenda, regardless of the effect of that on other nations of innocent people. The self reigns everywhere now. Community, the hope of humankind, the very nature of life, becomes more fragile by the day. And then the real question becomes, is there any way out of this state of things now that self is the center and the single definer of life? And if so, where would we go for a model? What is the antidote to self-centeredness gone wild? Obviously, the cure for narcissism may not be in the 20th century. In fact, the cure may lie in a little-known formula from 6th century monasticism. There it is. The administration may be dumb, but by God, they're bold. the cure for personal disorder, for national chauvinism, and a commitment to worthwhile work may lie in developing a passion for right relationships. Before society is abandoned to the survival of the fittest and its vision is reduced to the last billionaire or the last bully left standing. The truth is that corrosion of the human spirit has happened before and found its antidote in 6th century Rome. It is called the spirituality of humility, and historians, age after age after age since that, have told us over and over again that it saved Western civilization. In the 6th century, Benedict of Nursia, founder of what we now call Benedictinism, was a student in Rome. Rome was the center of the empire. Rome was the New York, the LA, the San Fran of its time, with all the glitz and glamour that implied in a society surfeited on excess but deteriorating from the inside out. Rome, the narcissistic power of that time, had overreached its power and overspent its resources on foreign legions that trumpeted its militarism, yes, but ironically weakened its foreign influence as a result and debased its internal character as well. More, it had overlooked, it had ignored the immigrants on its borders who were waiting, just waiting, to pour through its perimeters like a sieve, not to destroy the empire, but to share in the bounty that it hoarded for itself. Rome resisted those foreigners, those aliens, those immigrants, and Rome, the invincible Rome, the very city itself, was sacked and overwhelmed, its glory days over, its global leadership defunct. As in the book of Daniel, the handwriting was on the wall, but few, if anyone, could read it. In our own world, too, the headlines in our papers signal our withdrawal from the global community and our disdain for the rest of the global community, and few, if any, appear to understand the effect of that either. But in the 6th century, one person, this one young man, left Rome in its race to moral collapse and the norms of personal selfishness that went with its narcissism, and resolved to change the system, not by confronting it, not by competing with it to be bigger and better and more arrogant, but by eroding its incredible credibility. As Blaise Pascal would later write, quote, "It is true that force rules the world, but opinion loses force." This one single, young, lay person simply decided to change people's opinions about what life had to be by himself living otherwise and refusing to accept the debauched social and moral standards around him. And how did he do it? By starting a new lifestyle within a lifestyle, by forming people into communities of ideas that changed the way people thought and lived in that society. He wrote a rule for life that would eliminate destitution where his groups were, by seeing that everyone had enough of what they needed where they were, by seeing that they were devoted to the sharing of goods as he was, by seeing that they were as conscious of care for the earth as he was, by seeing that they would teach and model a new perspective on community and human development as he did. And so in chapter 7 of his rule, he outlines a spirituality of relationships called humility, which is not a synonym for humiliations, and changed the idea of what it meant to be truly human, a fully human being. In 12 Principles of Life, he set out to make 4 kinds of human relationships, the criteria of holiness. First, the way we see God, he teaches, will determine how we see all of life, as well as our own style of existence within it. Second, the way we respond to authority figures will dictate whether or not we can grow beyond ourselves. Third, he teaches that the way we see ourselves will define our place in the universe and the effect we will have on it. And fourth, the way we relate to others, he says, will become the measure of our spiritual life and the character of the society in which we live. So the major question has to be, at this moment in history, for all of us, what did he teach? And what does it mean to thee and me now and here in the way we think and live and work? I'm going to look at them one at a time. In steps 1 and 2 of humility, the Rule of Benedict teaches us who God really is. He says the first step of humility is to reverence the God whom we call Abba, Father, Daddy, Parent. He is saying, in other words, God is love. Note this. There is absolutely no description whatsoever in this 6th century Rule of Benedict of God as a slave driver or a cruel tyrant. There's only one definition of God in the rule: Abba, loving parent, Daddy, mercy. Our entire spiritual life, in other words, the way you and I live and feel and respond to others and to all of life, depends on the way we define God. Don't go to bed tonight without asking yourself, who is your God? Because it will determine how you respond to everybody else in whose image we say we are created. For instance, is your God the gotcha God? The God who told us to be perfect, which is impossible, and then just waits for us to fail and says, gotcha, and then can punish you for it, so you live in fear yourself? Is your God an unpredictable wonder worker who destroys people with physical pain and emotional confusion just to demonstrate some kind of irrational power over us, or to test our faith, as if life itself isn't test enough of anybody's faith? Or are we to think that God is a puppeteer who pulls all the strings of our lives until it counts and then doesn't and abandons us? Or is our God a magician who does tricks to get our attention? A vending machine, you know this one. This is the God of your automobile. Oh God, please make that light turn green before I get there. This is our Santa Claus God, our vending machine God, our magician God, who does tricks for us, provided we cajole and coax that God with, of course, the right kind of sacrifices and praise. But gods like that, who punish for the sake of punishing, who wield power for its own sake, who need to be coaxed to be godly, who toy with us for the fun of it, none of that, as Descartes says, dare to use your brain, none of that can possibly be godly. None of that is godly at all. No, Benedict teaches this God, whom we reverence and stand of awe of, Abba, the loving parent, the God of love, gives us life not to tease us with it, gives us life not to make it impossible for us. This God gives us life and then stays with us to support us in it as we go. In fact, this God is a humble God. This God began creation, but did not create it or did not finish it for us. Instead, this God, this humble God of ours, makes us co-creators of life, by giving us the means and the responsibility to complete this creation and sustain it ourselves. But how? But how? These steps of humility affect everything we do. These steps of relationship to the world determine who we are and how we shape the world around us. So let's look at them that way today. They will affect us personally, publicly, and professionally. The first step of humility is to reverence the God of love who created us. Well, then it makes sense, doesn't it? On the personal level, then, we're being called to relinquish our attempts to be our own God, because we know that God will give us the strength and the energy we need to wrestle with one dimension of life after another. Well, what about the public or political level, then? The first degree of humility on creation brings us to understand that we have no right to suppress or demean creation in anyone else. But if all of that is the case, then what about work? What would a Benedictine say is maybe one of the great works of this time to which we must respond? It is surely to distinguish between the godly and the ungodly ways that we ourselves are threatening any life on this planet, and then do something about it so that we may not only live life well ourselves, but preserve it for others. The second step of humility teaches that we love not our own will. That opens up another whole part of life for us. The point is that this one, do you believe in one God? Yes or no? Tell sister. Yes. Well, then, if we only believe in one God, we surely must believe that that one God is giving the same messages to everybody on the planet, don't we? And in another language, in another color, and another culture, but the messages have got to be the same. This second step of humility, then, is telling us that God wills the same good for all the people on the planet. And to accept God's will above my own is, in essence, to promise that we ourselves will not obstruct good for others in any way, anywhere. On the personal level, this means we would surely make racism impossible. On the political level, the second degree of humility would certainly mean that keeping other people out of the garden of life in order to have the riches of it for ourselves requires us to rethink, for instance, our immigration policies and our foreign policies. And we would surely not be doing anything as a nation that would destroy, pollute, poison, or extinguish the ecology of creation. We would not be playing God ourselves with life. We would not make national choices that allow the whole world to flourish. And just as important, we would come to understand that trying to merit God through a checklist of pious acts, so many prayers and penances, all pretenses to piety, all the while calling ourselves saved while the community of life is not safe in our hands, is false piety. Surely a great work in this time, then, is for us to repudiate economic slavery, to see that all workers get a living wage, not simply a minimum wage, so that their families, too, can live a decent life. The third step of humility is that we accept the direction of others so that we can learn from other people's wisdom. Then we can come to realize that there are other ways and other answers and other plans out there beside ours that are every bit as good as our own. On the personal level, we can even stop scheming to gain control. We might even become less critical of other people. On the public and political level, the democratic system itself begins to heal when pride is no longer permitted, to exclude anyone from the system. When everybody is invited into the decision-making process, the entire system itself becomes a humble one, really becomes an instrument of national unity and world peace. Our work now is to learn as individuals to listen in such a way that critics can be seen as collaborators rather than enemies, and partisanship becomes a thing of the past. The fourth step of humility teaches that, difficult as it may be to accept someone else's authority beside my own, that we must persist in this process even when growth is slow, even when it's discouraging, even when it seems to fail. We must keep doing and saying and modeling what must be done to change opinions for the better. And as a result, on the personal level, we learn the ways of people who do things other than we would do them, and then, what do you believe? We discover that the world does not end when it functions someone else's way. On the public level, we would accept direction from those who experience life other than we do. We might even listen to the United Nations, for instance, before we decimated Muslim communities, because we do not understand their religious values and therefore are afraid of them. And finally, then, an important work for us in this time is for ourselves to learn personally, me, in a fresh, new way, how to be alive, to discover that difference is not a synonym for difficulty. Clearly, this call of the first 4 degrees of humility, awareness of God, trust in the will of God, acceptance of the wisdom of others as the will of God for us, and persistence in difficult circumstances is our great call to forego arrogance and omnipotence. Once we know that there is only one God, and we are not it, and that others are also carriers of God's will to us, we are at the threshold of spiritual adulthood. But then come steps 5 to 8 of right relationships through humility that bring us, here's where the rubber hits the road, take it easy, we are brought to face ourselves. This is called know thyself. Now we must get truthful with ourselves about our weaknesses, our gnawing desires, that inner certainty we have of our superiority. The 5th step of humility teaches us that we should open ourselves to a spiritual guide about our own death-dealing struggles for status and station, because that is essential to growth and happiness. This 6th century document knew what psychology in our time now confirms. Self-disclosure always leads to growth. Why? Because it separates us from our false images. It drains away the little hypocrisies that have taken seed. It ends all our puny little charades so other people will think we're as good as they think we are good. And it frees our real self to grow. On the personal level, the 5th step of humility calls us to reveal the demons that have mastered us. The shame, maybe. The destructiveness and jealousies, maybe. The pretenses, perhaps, so that our souls may fly free and we may return to the world around us a gentler, kinder, more understanding person in the rest of it. Women who spoke out about sexual harassment and abuse, who unveiled their own lives, forswore to their eternal credit their own public image for the welfare of other women, that is personal humility at work. Those who swallow a stone become a stone. Those who swallow a stone become a stone, the proverb says, and that's true. But it is humility that rolls the stone of hypocrisy away. Indeed, on the public level, the fifth degree of humility, this self-revelation, saves me from the burden of perfection because I have now admitted that I'm not. The struggles we hide, in other words, consume our energies, and they hold us captive to our secrets. What if they knew? What if they found out? What if somebody told them? What if she knows when she looks at me? What if he said? They consume our energies. They hold us captive to our secrets. But who or what can diminish you if you admit them yourselves? No, I'm not from a wealthy family. Yes, my father was in jail. Yes, I gave up the child. Yes, I was arrested for forgery. Yes, I lied and destroyed another's life. Yes, yes, yes to all of it. Because then the private wars for status end and self-righteousness dies. As our sister Mary Lou Kanaki writes so beautifully, who is it that we would not love if we only knew their stories? Who is it that we would not love if we only knew their stories? So our great work now is in ourselves. It is an exercise in honest self-appraisal, in the awareness that perfection is not perfect, in the joy and freedom that comes with being allowed to be fallible again. The sixth step of humility saves us from all the disappointments in life. If you get this far in the 12 degrees of humility, I promise you, you will never, ever be disappointed in life again. The sixth step of humility says we are content with the lowest and most menial of all treatment. We are content with the lowest and most menial of treatment. We are called, in other words, not to accept humiliations. No one should accept humiliations. That's an American corruption of humility. It is no part of humility at all. But we are called to accept the natural circumstances of life. Not to live over your head, live simply. Not to pretend you're somebody you're not, put on no airs. To have no expectations of preference, to simply be me, I, my real unadorned self. If then on the personal level, if I never expect special treatment, I can never be insulted again when the invitation does not come. When I'm not elected committee chair, when I have to stand in line for tickets just like everybody else, when there's no reserved seat for me at dinner, I will not be crushed. I will not feel ashamed of who I am. I will not call it poor treatment. I am freed now from the pain of presumption. On the public level, too, the sixth degree of humility reminds us not to live on assumptions of special delivery or protection in face of dangers that are being faced even by the smallest nations and their concerns. Small countries in the Pacific, for instance, who are concerned about the global warming we deny, we ignore, or Puerto Rico, perhaps, and its cries for disaster aid, have as much right to be heard and helped despite their smaller size as we do with our more miles of flood lands. And so our great work, yours and mine, must be in this time to really care for the least of these, to value and recognize, to enhance and support the dreams and needs of our auxiliary staff as much as we do our board members, and to embrace the needs and dreams of the weak everywhere, as well as the prominent. In the seventh degree of humility, we not only admit with our tongues, but we're also convinced in our hearts. We're telling the truth. We are not superior to anybody, not anybody at all. In fact, if truth were known, we know that we are in some way inferior to all. On the personal level, I know, standing here, I know, I've known it all my life. that everywhere I am, there is someone there who is wiser, smarter, kinder, more talented, more experienced, more educated, more whatever than I am. I am not universally superior to anyone, let alone to everyone. No one is. On the public level, then, there's always something we can learn as people from the others we're with that night. Something we can admire in others, something we know ourselves to be, and something we know ourselves to be less capable of than others are. And it's then that all cultural boundaries disappear, all prejudice disintegrates, and all divisions become conformable. Then your work and my work in a global world has got to be to make connections, real, personal, flesh and blood connections with those most unlike us, so that we can all discover how really alike we are. And in the 8th step of humility, the rule says we are to endorse our own actions, we are to endorse our actions by the communities that have formed us and the traditions and examples of good living we've been raised in. On the personal level, then, we honor all traditions and cultures. Self-worship, which is the beginning of cruelties to others, ends. And so on the public level, the 8th degree of humility is challenging us to explain then how, in the light of our national tradition, experience, and what we say have been our community ideals, we are still calling ourselves Americans, while we ignore our history of accepting strangers with open arms. And the greatest number of arrests in the United States today are of illegal immigrants who haven't committed a crime, while immigrant children are crying for their missing mothers at night. Our work. Our work in this time is that we remember and do not allow that anyone be exempted from honoring the common good of the tradition. Finally, in steps 9 to 12 of humility, we learn the tools of relationship. In the 9th degree of humility, we learn to be silent so that others can be heard. In the 10th degree of humility, we learn not to laugh at or ridicule the people around us. In the 11th degree of humility, we learn that nothing that hurts or demeans another, like nicknames that insult a person, is funny. We learn that racism and sexism are not humor. They're just cheap ways of making myself look good by making others look bad. We learn to be kind to those who are also like us, just wrestling with the dregs of life. Then, without a doubt, our great work in this time is to recover civil discourse. To require character as a quality of leadership, as well as skill. To raise the children of the next generation to respect every human being, however other or unlike themselves. We, in every group we're in, must refuse the lewd, crude, rude, and caustic language that demeans and diminishes, that labels and belittles anyone's humanity, and is fast becoming the norm of the language of this society. We ourselves must be emotionally balanced in our bearing as well as in our hearts. No, not in order to be politically correct, in order to be emotionally adult and spiritually mature. If the 12 steps of humility had been written today, if I had written them, they would have sounded very much like this, I think. Number 1, recognize that only God is God. Number 2, know that God wills the same good for all people. 3, seek out and learn from wisdom figures. 4, endure the pains of development and change and conversion, and do not give up ever. 5, acknowledge faults. Remove your masks. 6, be content with less than the best. 7, let go of a false sense of superiority. 8, preserve tradition and learn from community. 9, listen to others. 10, never ridicule anyone or anything. 11, speak kindly. And 12, be serene also in your bearing. Stay calm. Then, you see, I promise you, as the rule promises you, then you will have melted into the heart of God. Then you will be full of life. Then you will be simple in your needs, free of wants, and serene of heart. You will be, as Blaise Pascal says, a community within the community, an opinion changer. And you will be transformed. And most of all, your work will be transforming of this people, this nation, your own little world around you. And yes, civilization will be saved again. Why? Because the soul always pours over into the physical. Remember, too, that if narcissism is awareness of self, humility is simply awareness of God. If narcissism is scornful, humility is respectful of all. If narcissism is disdainful of others, humility listens to everyone. If narcissism rests on fixed and static ideas, humility is always open to growth. If humility is them and me, humility is we and us. If narcissism tears the world apart, as it is doing in our age and in our nation, Rome and the rule of Benedict is proof that humility can and has and will put it back together again. Then, as Solomon Ibn Gabriel says, we too will have seeing hearts. Then, as the Sufi teaches, we will carry a light within us. And then, as Abba Zosimus knew, our passion for life will free us to become the fullness of ourselves. And most of all, this week on work, remember the really important works of our time: humility rather than narcissism, openness rather than exclusion, personal transparency rather than scam, human respect rather than ridicule, civil discourse rather than insult, and the preservation of all life, not simply our own. Remember, too, time changes nothing. People do. Because I came today to remind you, most of all, you are the only missing element in the accomplishment of all these things. Without you, as Toffler warns, if we do not shape the future, we shall be compelled to endure it. But if the people will lead, eventually the leaders will follow. Lead, dear friends, for all our sakes. Thank you for coming.
You're going to hate me for this. We have time for 2 questions. There's one over here. Maybe just one. Yes, please.
Sister Joan, I'd love to hear your comment to this paradox. To me, you're a national and international treasure. Your book, The Gift of Life, was life-changing for me, and if you had been Pope, the world would be different. However, at the same time, having done a deep dive on Christianity and Judaism and a 45-year dive in Buddhism, I have to say that my own personal belief, what works for me, is that humans created God. God didn't create humans. And that the Buddhist focus on that we all become bodhisattvas and that we all have that responsibility to help all others and that we can't look to a God for that. But it's done in a way, like through Matthieu Ricard.
So we need a question.
Yeah, well, I already said my question. I would love to hear your comment for people like me on how we put those things together.
You mean, I need to specify, what are those things together?
So you are basing your leading people towards kindness, compassion, etc., on a belief in a loving God. And I'm saying,
I see what you're saying.
There's no way that
Yes.
works for me.
Well, yeah, it does.
Many other
yeah.
Buddhist-
Yes, it does, because there's a magnet in every heart. There's a magnet in every human being in this audience, in this community. These magnets lead us where we're supposed to go. These magnets are part of our creation. Therefore, they're created by the energy of life. Whatever your name for that is, you are being drawn to the ultimate. And you should go the path that is the strongest, straightest path for you. Get out of the philosophy, get out of the metaphysics, get out of the psychology, follow the magnet, you're going to be fine.
Thank you, Sister Joan. At the last papal conclave, a Bishop Bergoglio was across the hall from Cardinal Casper, who handed him a book, and the title of the book was Mercy. When Cardinal Bergoglio received it, he said, "This is the name of our God." And we can see what happened with that. I wonder if you could comment on your church and the way that this understanding of God that you've talked about is now beginning to be brought to the world in a new way through Pope Francis.
Oh, well, you've asked the easiest question of the afternoon. And I thank you, because I'm tired. No. That man has internalized mercy. I have a private theory about Pope Francis. It's very public. I take it a little deeper. I'm not going to say it out loud about a human being. But that man has been through some great conversion. Remember that he describes himself as having started as a very rigid, rigorous, unforgiving. He was basically a terrible young provincial. The only thing that measured anything he did were the rules he kept and wanted everybody. All of those human rules for the sake of our comfort and convenience have nothing to do with our sanctity, really. They just, we have a rule in the monastery, you should hand your keys in when you come so everybody knows the car is home. That's a really necessary rule, but if you break it, nobody I know is going to go to hell for it. There's a big difference between order and organization and what are the rules of the heart. This man was into order and organization big. He was also into identifying not just with the rules of the order, but with the government. He was hobnobbing. He thought he had a lot of influence, and he did it the right way. And his younger brethren were in the barrios with the poorest. And they were afraid of revolution. These are huge barrios. They're 10, 20, 30,000, 40, 50,000 people, 100,000 in some of them in South Africa. And they were scared to death that somebody's going to throw a lighted match into the middle of one of those barrios. And they had a right to be scared because that government did nothing for its needy, nothing at all. So these young Jesuits were down there taking care of the people, teaching them the prophetic, Jesus the prophet. Well, Christians love Jesus the healer. Oh, they think that's great. They follow Jesus the healer. They're always nice people. They give milk and water, and that's terrific. But the rest of the Jesus dimension is Jesus the prophet, the one who walks from Galilee to Jerusalem, contending with the scribes and the Pharisees, curing the sick, raising women from the dead. He's completely outside the system. He doesn't keep any rule, because all of those rules are perpetuating a system that is evil. This man went through that. He was that. And he wanted his brothers out of the barrio because it wasn't good. It wasn't nice. They should be home at 5 o'clock. They should be praying at 6 o'clock. That's what he put. Now, do I agree with those things? Do I accept those things? I more than accept them. They are absolutely essential to our religious development and the development of a soft heart. But you can't take them too far. None of the mystics, all of the mystics were over the edge of the rules. All of the great saints broke every rule in trying to do what needed to be done at the time. He was there. And then he saw what happened. The brothers were killed. The eruption happened anyway. He suffered. He suffered deeply. And he came out of that tomb on the other side, full of mercy, understanding mercy. I think he's a very holy man. And I believe that some of our holiest people were our greatest sinners, and that's how they knew what mercy was really all about. So I love Francis. I don't measure anything about him. But he got it the hard way. Try to do it better than that.